Let's talk about an example where, for the time being, we're going to imagine that a single part number 1, is inspected. For sake of argument, let's suppose that it is inspected a fixed number of times, so inspected m times by each of, for sake of argument here, we'll talk about j equal to 3 operators. In a bit, we'll make this a bit more complicated and think about what one might do if there's not just a single part here, but there are multiple parts inspected by inspected by 3 operators. But for the time being, let's just talk about this one part. If we think about what happens when each of these operators inspects this hypothetical part, so we get operators 1, 2, and 3, and we're going to talk, for sake of argument here, about m equal 10. So we're going to think about a situation in which each operator checks the part 10 times. And operator number 1 looks at the part, makes a judgment, passes it to number 2, who makes a judgment, passes it to number 3, who makes a judgment. In practical terms, it's not going to make any sense to then turn around and give it back to operator number 1 immediately if that person recognizes this part and knows how he called it in the past. So we're going to have to think about something like this part being one of a large number that these operators make calls on without remembering what they called the last time that they inspected the part. We're going to invent or use here a coding, for sake of argument, that says 1 is non-conforming and 0 is conforming. So we're going to think about a scenario in which these operators make 10 calls, and what we're going to record here are either 1s or 0s, depending upon whether they call the part non-conforming or conforming. For sake of illustration here, let's write down some hypothetical records for these operators. Perhaps operator number 1 calls it non-conforming, conforming, 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 non-conforming. There are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 calls for operator number 1. For sake of argument, let's suppose that operator number 2 calls it non-conforming, conforming, non-conforming, conforming. So there are 6 calls. There are 10. And for sake of argument, let's suppose that operator number 3 calls conforming, conforming, non-conforming. The idea is that each of these operators makes 10 calls on these parts. And sometimes calling 1, sometimes calling 0, that is, sometimes calling non-conforming, sometimes calling conforming. And we want to think about what in the world would R&R mean in this context. Well, in the first place, repeatability is qualitatively consistency for an operator. So a perfectly consistent operator would either call all zeros or all ones. The fact that when we look at these records for these three operators, those calls are not all the same is perhaps an indication of repeatability variation. In order to be able to talk about that and have some notation for that, what we're going to do is to use a notation like this. I'm going to call x1 the count of non-conforming calls, so it's the number of ones there for operator number 1. That's 2. 2 out of 10. I'll call x2. Now it's the number of number 1 calls for operator 2. That's 4. And x3 is the number of number 1 calls for operator 3, and that's 2 again. If I were to divide those counts, x's, by the number of calls, by the number of inspections, if I take x1 over m, that's going to be 2/10.2. x2 over m is going to be 4 in 10, and x3 over m is going to be again 0.2. I might call that p hat number 1, p hat number 2, and p hat number 3. And again, my point here in laying out this little hypothetical list of ones and zeros is that this first R, repeatability variation, has to do with inconsistency within an operator. That boils down to p hats that are neither 0 nor 1. That's repeatability variation. Reproducibility variation, that is the second of these things, has to do with differences between the operators in the way they're doing things. And I might think about variation among these values as being indicators of reproducibility variation. So the fact that the p hats are not 0 or 1 is an indication of repeatability variation. The fact that they are not all the same is perhaps an indication of reproducibility variation.